I'm going to ask you one last time. Move to the back of the train, or I'll have security escort you off." The demand cut through the air, carrying a weight of authority tainted with condescension. The conductor stood tall, her uniform pristine, her stance rigid with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Across from her sat a black woman, calm, poised, and unshaken by the growing tension. She met the conductor's gaze with quiet confidence. "I've already told you, I'm not moving." Her voice was steady, firm but composed, laced with an unshakable certainty. Passengers stole glances at the confrontation, some whispering behind cupped hands, others pretending to be engrossed in their newspapers or phones, eager to avoid involvement. But no one expected what would happen next, because the woman they thought was powerless was about to show them exactly who she was. Before we dive deeper, if you believe everyone should be treated with respect, no matter their race, hit the subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from. The sleek, high-speed train sat poised on the tracks, gleaming under the soft glow of the station's overhead lights. A marvel of modern engineering, its streamlined design promised a journey of luxury and exclusivity. Beyond the platform's bustling movement, the interior of the train offered a stark contrast, serene, refined, and meticulously arranged for its elite clientele. Inside, first class exuded quiet opulence. Plush leather seats and deep mahogany lined the spacious cabin, their surfaces untouched by wear. Polished wood panels gleamed under dim, golden lighting that cast a warm, inviting glow. The air carried a faint trace of expensive cologne and freshly brewed espresso, mingling with the subtle hum of conversation spoken in hushed, measured tones. Passengers moved with an effortless grace, dressed in crisp designer suits and elegant dresses that whispered of old money and exclusive circles. A woman in pearls sipped from a glass of imported wine, her manicured fingers adjusting the delicate stem. A businessman checked his gold-rimmed watch before leaning back in his seat, scrolling through his phone with detached ease. A well-dressed couple settled in near the window, murmuring about their weekend retreat in hushed, indulgent voices. Into this world of quiet privilege stepped Celeste Moreau. Composed, self-assured, she moved with the effortless elegance of someone accustomed to high standards, but uninterested in drawing attention. Dressed in a tailored midnight blue blazer and matching trousers, her presence commanded subtle respect, though she never sought it. Her heels barely made a sound against the polished floor as she made her way to her seat, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. The train attendants stationed near the entrance greeted passengers with professional warmth. Their smiles widened for those they recognized, the well-connected, the wealthy, the ones who belonged. "Good evening, Mr. Sinclair," one attendant said with a deferential nod as she accepted the man's coat, her tone light and pleasant. "Lovely to have you aboard again." "Mrs. Levine, your preferred seat is ready," another said to an older woman adorned with diamonds, her presence met with quiet admiration. But when Celeste approached, the warmth in their voices cooled, just slightly, but noticeably. "First class is reserved for priority guests," one of them said, the smile on her lips practiced but empty. Celeste met her gaze without flinching. "I know!" A moment of hesitation. Then, with a reluctant nod, the attendant stepped aside. Passengers glanced up briefly before returning to their indulgences. To them, she was just another traveler, another body filling a seat. But not to everyone. Behind Celeste, a seasoned couple settled into their seats with the ease of frequent travelers. Mr. and Mrs. Carmichael, both in their 60s, exuded quiet affluence. Mrs. Carmichael, with her neatly styled silver hair, held a delicate knitting project in her lap, her fingers moving with practiced precision. Mr. Carmichael, a retired judge, folded his newspaper methodically before casting a glance at the scene unfolding before him. The attendant's subtle shift in demeanor hadn't escaped his notice. Celeste took her seat, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer as she set her bag down beside her. She wasn't surprised by the reception. It was familiar, expected. But what mattered was that she was exactly where she intended to be. The train doors slid shut. The journey was about to begin. The train glided forward with seamless precision, its gentle momentum carrying passengers toward their destinations. Inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere settled into quiet indulgence. Glasses clinked softly as attendants poured drinks, the muted rustle of newspapers and the occasional clearing of throats punctuating the air. Conversations were hushed but deliberate. Discussions of upcoming business deals, exclusive events, and weekend getaways filled the space. Everything was as it should be, until Margot Whitman stepped in. The lead conductor, a woman in her early 40s, carried herself with the rigid authority of someone who believed order was her personal domain. Every detail of her appearance was meticulously arranged: her neatly pressed uniform, the sharp pleats of her navy blue skirt, the precise way she adjusted the cuffs of her jacket. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight, severe bun, revealing a face lined not by age but by years of holding others to an exacting standard. Margot thrived on control, and to her, control meant ensuring that everything and everyone remained in their proper place. She moved through the cabin, her keen eyes scanning each row with an air of quiet judgment. When she passed the Carmichaels, her demeanor softened, her lips curling into a polite smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Carmichael," she greeted, her voice carrying just enough warmth to be pleasant. "Welcome back. It's always a pleasure having you aboard." Mrs. Carmichael, barely looking up from her knitting, offered a nod in return. Her husband simply grunted, distracted by the article in front of him. Margot continued down the aisle, her sharp gaze flicking over each passenger. She acknowledged a young executive with an approving glance, then offered a warm smile to a woman adorned in pearls, who barely acknowledged her in return. Then she saw Celeste Moreau. Her expression changed instantly. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by something colder. She stopped abruptly, her polished shoes clicking against the floor as she turned to face Celeste, who sat calmly in her seat, her posture relaxed but poised. Margot's lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen passengers like this before, people who thought they could wander into first-class stock hoping to slip past unnoticed, people who didn't belong. Margot squared her shoulders, inhaling as if bracing for confrontation. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice polite but edged with condescension. "I believe you're in the wrong section." A few heads lifted at the sudden break in the peaceful atmosphere. Some passengers merely glanced over before returning to their distractions. Others lingered a moment longer, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Celeste, unfazed, turned her gaze toward Margot. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes carried a quiet weight. "I believe this is my seat," she responded evenly. Margot's jaw tightened. "I don't think so," she said, the pleasant veneer in her voice slipping just slightly. "This section is reserved for our first-class passengers." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. A woman in the next row tilted her head, pretending to be engrossed in her book, but clearly listening in. A businessman across the aisle glanced up from his phone, his brow furrowing. Celeste remained composed, unshaken by the sudden attention. "You might want to check your passenger list before making assumptions," she said, her tone even. Margot's eyes narrowed. "I don't need to check anything," she snapped. "I know who belongs here and who doesn't." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The tension, once subtle, became unmistakable. Passengers exchanged glances, some intrigued, others visibly uncomfortable. A middle-aged man whispered under his breath, "Why doesn't she just move if she's in the wrong seat?" Another woman shrugged. "Probably trying to get a free upgrade." Margot folded her arms across her chest. She had handled situations like this before. People who refused to follow the rules, people who challenged authority. She wasn't about to back down. "If you don't move to the back of the train," she said, her voice now loud enough for others to hear, "I'll have security escort you off at the next station." Celeste tilted her head slightly, her expression unwavering. "Call whoever you need to," she replied, "but I'm not moving." A quiet gasp came from somewhere in the cabin. A well-dressed socialite leaned toward her companion, whispering something in hushed tones. Margot's patience was wearing thin. Her posture stiffened, her fingers curling at her sides. She turned sharply to a junior train attendant, Ela Harrington, who stood a few feet away, observing the scene with uncertainty. "Escort her to the back," Margot ordered, her voice clipped. Ela hesitated. She glanced between Margot and Celeste, clearly torn. Her hands twitched at her sides, as if debating whether or not to speak up. Celeste shifted slightly in her seat, her gaze still fixed on Margot. Her voice when she spoke was calm but carried an unmistakable edge. "You might want to think carefully about what you're doing." Margot scoffed. I know exactly what I'm doing, she said. Then, with an impatient wave of her hand, now, get up. Margot's jaw clenched. She had expected hesitation, maybe even an apology. But instead, Celeste met her gaze with quiet defiance, completely unaffected by her threats. Margot turned sharply toward Isla, the junior attendant who had been standing off to the side, her fingers nervously gripping the edge of a service cart. Get security, Margot snapped. Isla hesitated, glancing between Celeste and the conductor. Her expression wavered, uncertain. Are you sure we shouldn't? Margot's glare cut through her words. Now. Isla swallowed hard before hurrying toward the front of the train. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. What's going to happen? Someone whispered. She should have just moved, another voice muttered. Margot turned back to Celeste, her satisfaction barely concealed. We'll see what security has to say about this. Celeste simply crossed one leg over the other, her expression unreadable. We will, she said. Passengers braced themselves, sensing the storm brewing ahead. The weight of Margot's order pressed down on her, her fingers tightening around the hem of her uniform. She had seen enough to know this wasn't right. But Margot was the lead conductor. What choice did she have? Steeling herself, she took a hesitant step forward, her voice softer than intended. Ma'am, if you'll just come with me. Celeste didn't so much as glance at her. Her gaze remained fixed on Margot, calm yet unyielding. Isla's stomach twisted. The tension in the train car thickened, wrapping itself around every passenger like an invisible cord. Some stared, unable to tear their eyes away from the unfolding scene. Others buried themselves deeper into their seats, pretending to be engrossed in their phones or magazines, too afraid or too indifferent to get involved. A low whisper passed between two businessmen near the window. Why doesn't she just move? One muttered. The other exhaled through his nose, probably trying to cause a scene. Across the aisle, a woman clutched her purse a little tighter, her brows furrowed in mild disapproval. An older man, however, leaned forward, his expression unreadable as he studied Celeste's unshaken demeanor. Margot's patience had officially run out. Her nostrils flared, her grip on control slipping with every passing second. Celeste refused to comply. She needed to put this woman in her place. Without breaking eye contact, Margot turned sharply, grabbing a half-filled glass of water from the service cart beside her. The ice clinked against the glass as she lifted it, pausing just long enough for those watching to understand exactly what she was about to do. Then, without hesitation, she tipped the glass forward. Cold liquid splashed down onto Celeste's lap, soaking into the dark fabric of her blazer and pooling onto the polished floor beneath her seat. A collective gasp rippled through the passengers. The businessman by the window straightened. The woman with the pearl necklace pressed a hand to her mouth. Even the nosy socialite, who had been enjoying the spectacle, now sat stiffly, her painted nails gripping the armrest. Celeste exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. Margot smirked. Maybe next time, watch where you put your things, she sneered, her voice laced with mock concern. I'd hate for another accident to happen. Silence. Isla's hands trembled. This was too far. She took a step forward, opening her mouth to protest, but Celeste moved first. With the same quiet grace she had carried since the moment she stepped onto the train, Celeste lifted her hand, brushing the damp fabric of her blazer with slow, deliberate movements. She did not react. She did not flinch. She did not speak. The humiliation Margot had intended, the submission, the anger, the retaliation, never came. Celeste simply continued. The sheer lack of reaction unsettled Margot more than any outburst ever could. Her smirk faltered. The power she thought she held, the control she had been grasping onto so desperately, was slipping through her fingers. She needed more. She needed to break this woman. Margot's hand clenched at her side, nails digging into her palm. Her heart pounded, the heat of her frustration crawling up her neck. Then, before she could think, before anyone could stop her, she raised her hand and slapped Celeste across the face. The sharp crack of palm against skin echoed through the train car, cutting through the hum of the moving train like a blade. Everything, every rustling page, every hushed whisper, every shifting movement stopped. Passengers froze. Isla gasped audibly, both hands flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The two businessmen stared, mouths slightly agape. The pearl-clad woman clutched her necklace so tightly her knuckles turned white. A few rows ahead, Mrs. Carmichael's knitting needle stilled, her hands motionless over the soft strands of wool. Her husband lowered his newspaper, his sharp, seasoned eyes locking onto Margot with unreadable intensity. Even the nosy socialite, who had been leaning forward eagerly, now leaned back. Slowly. Margot's chest rose and fell rapidly, her pulse hammering in her ears. Celeste remained perfectly still. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed as if she hadn't even registered the blow. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted her head. Her face, though slightly turned from the force of the slap, was unreadable. Her breathing remained steady. Her hands, still resting on her lap, did not tremble. But her eyes. When Celeste finally turned her gaze back to Margot, when those dark, knowing eyes locked onto the woman standing above her, something shifted. A deep, suffocating tension pressed into the train car, heavier than before. Margot, who had spent years enforcing order, who had prided herself on maintaining control, felt something she had not felt in a very, very long time. A flicker of fear. Celeste exhaled softly, tilting her head. You just made the worst mistake of your life. And this time, everyone believed her. Margot scoffed, shaking off the unease that curled at the edges of her mind. Mistake? She had heard empty threats before. Passengers who thought they could intimidate their way into better seats, travelers who believed a little defiance would win them sympathy. This was no different. You think I'm afraid of you? Margot sneered, forcing a smirk. She adjusted the cuffs of her jacket as if regaining the control she had momentarily lost. You're just another entitled passenger who doesn't know her place. The murmurs in the cabin had shifted. Passengers were no longer whispering about whether Celeste belonged in first class. They were whispering about the slap. The air inside the train felt heavier now, charged with an energy that hadn't been there before. A silent, collective realization had begun to settle over the onlookers, one that Margot had yet to grasp. She had crossed a line. Near the front of the car, Isla's heart pounded. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over the passenger list, the laminated paper slick beneath her touch. Her instincts screamed at her to step away, to pretend she saw nothing, but she couldn't. Something about the way Celeste sat unmoved, untouched by Margot's display of power, something about her calmness made Isla's stomach twist. This woman wasn't afraid, and that, more than anything, terrified Isla. She swallowed hard, glancing toward the conductor, who still stood rigidly, arms folded, oblivious to the shift in the room. Then, slowly, Isla dragged her gaze down to the manifest. Her eyes scanned the names, heart hammering in her chest. She knew what she was looking for, and the moment she found it, her breath hitched. Celeste Moreau. The name stood out in crisp, bold letters beside an identifier that sent a sharp chill through Isla's spine. Executive Director, Moreau Rail Industries. The air inside the train car suddenly felt suffocating. She lifted her head, panic creeping into her features. Celeste wasn't just another passenger. She wasn't just some woman refusing to move. She owned the very railway they were traveling on. Isla's fingers tightened around the edge of the clipboard. Oh, God. Margot had no idea. Her throat went dry, her mind racing as she realized how badly this was about to spiral. She needed to say something. She needed to stop this before a soft tap, tap, tap broke through the tension. Every pair of eyes flicked toward the source of the sound. Celeste? Still seated, still composed, she reached for her phone. The movement was slow, effortless, as if she had all the time in the world. She unlocked the screen with a simple swipe, her fingers gliding over the glass surface as she typed a brief message. Then, with the same deliberate care, she set the phone down on the armrest beside her. The gesture was small, but it sent a ripple of unease through the room. Margot's smirk faltered. What do you think you're doing? She demanded, her voice no longer carrying the same smug confidence. Celeste didn't answer. She didn't need to. Something about the way she moved, the way she placed the phone down with quiet certainty, made the train feel smaller, the walls pressing in closer. Passengers exchanged glances. The businessman across the aisle shifted in his seat, his frown deepening. The socialite who had once found amusement in the situation was now silent, her fingers gripping the handle of her designer purse a little too tightly. Even Mrs. Carmichael, who had yet to look up from her knitting, let out a soft as if sensing the shift without needing to see it. Margot swallowed. Well, she snapped. What's so important on that phone? Celeste exhaled softly, tilting her head. You'll find out soon enough. A fresh wave of silence swept over the cabin. The words weren't loud, they weren't threatening, but the way Celeste spoke them, the way she held herself, unwavering, unimpressed, made the statement feel like a warning. Margot forced out another laugh, but it lacked the confidence it once held. You think you can scare me with a phone call? She mocked, though there was an edge of unease creeping into her tone now. Celeste didn't respond. She merely leaned back, adjusting her cuffs as if this entire ordeal were nothing more than an inconvenience. Margot's throat tightened. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. And for the first time since this confrontation began, she felt it. She felt the unmistakable sensation of losing control. Passengers were no longer looking at Celeste with suspicion. They were looking at Margot, at her rigid posture, at the growing flush in her cheeks, at the way her fingers twitched, subtle but undeniable. And then, like a slow-moving wave, realization began creeping through the train car. Margot could feel it, the shift, the moment where she became the spectacle, the aggressor, the one being scrutinized. Isla's hands were ice cold as she clutched the passenger list against her chest. Her eyes darted toward the front of the train. Any second now, any second this would reach the people in charge. Margot had spent years maintaining order, years ensuring things ran exactly as she dictated. But today, she had made a terrible, terrible mistake, and she was about to find out just how bad it truly was. The low hum of the train's movement filled the cabin, but the silence between the passengers had become deafening. Margot stood stiffly, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin, defiant line. But her composure was slipping. The weight of Celeste's last words, "You'll find out soon enough," lingered like an unspoken threat, seeping into the air around her. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been merely observing now sat forward, hands clasped together, his brows furrowed in deep thought. The nosy socialite, who had once delighted in the drama, had gone uncharacteristically quiet, her fingers fidgeting against the pearl necklace resting on her collarbone. Even Mr. Carmichael, who had spent the entire journey half buried in his newspaper, had lowered the crisp pages to glance over his glasses at the scene unfolding before him. Something was happening. Something big. Then, footsteps from the front of the train, not hurried, not rushed, deliberate. The rhythmic clicking of polished shoes against the sleek floor sent an electric charge through the room, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself to be noticed. Passengers shifted, straightened, turned their heads toward the approaching figure. Margot's smugness flickered, her spine stiffened as she followed the sound. And then he appeared. Dominic Ellison, the head of railway operations. His suit was impeccable, every inch of him exuding authority, his expression sharp, unreadable. But the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw, it was unmistakable. Something was wrong. He wasn't happy. He stepped into the cabin, his piercing gaze sweeping the room, taking in the hushed whispers, the frozen postures, the barely concealed anticipation hanging in the air. And then his eyes landed on Margot. She straightened instantly. "Sir," she began, her voice forced into its usual tone of control. "I was just handling a situation with an unruly passenger." "Step aside." The words cut through the space like a blade. Margot blinked. For the first time since this all began, her posture faltered. Passengers exchanged glances. Mr. Carmichael muttered a quiet well. "Now that's interesting," as he set his newspaper aside completely. Margot swallowed, a flicker of confusion darting across her face. "Sir," she tried again, forcing an uncertain smile. "I was just making sure our policies are enforced." "I said step aside." This time there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. Margot hesitated, but the look in his eyes told her this was not a request. Slowly, rigidly, she stepped back, and then Ellison turned to Celeste. Margot waited, expected him to reprimand her, to demand her removal, to justify everything Margot had done up until now. But instead, Ellison's entire demeanor shifted. His sharp, commanding presence softened instantly, his expression rearranging itself into something eerily close to concern. Then he spoke. "Miss Moreau," he said, his voice suddenly laced with deep, genuine respect. Margot's breath hitched. The name hit her like a freight train. But Ellison kept speaking, seemingly unaware of how the air had vanished from Margot's lungs. "My sincerest apologies for the treatment you've received today," he said. "The railway is in perfect condition for your inspection. If there's anything you require, please don't hesitate to let me know." The world stopped. The entire train car seemed to exhale at once. A thunderclap of realization crashed through the passengers, expressions shifting in real time. The businessman's brows shot up, his posture snapping straight. The nosy socialite let out a tiny, audible gasp, her manicured fingers flying to her lips. The woman with the pearl necklace let out a strangled sound, half shock, half realization, her fingers going slack against her jewelry. Even Mrs. Carmichael, who had been knitting with quiet indifference, let the yarn slip between her fingers as she lifted her gaze in what could only be described as genuine intrigue. Celeste Moreau, the owner of Moreau Rail Industries, the woman Margot had humiliated, Margot's boss. The blood drained from her face so fast she nearly staggered. No, this had to be a mistake, a coincidence, something, anything other than what it actually was. Her lips parted, a strangled noise escaping her throat as her mind raced, scrambling to catch up with the destruction unfolding before her. She had assumed, and now she had ruined herself. Passengers murmured in hushed disbelief, their earlier judgment now fully redirected. Celeste Moreau, a woman who could have walked onto this train and announced who she was. A woman who could have demanded immediate recognition, instant obedience, but she hadn't. She had let Margot show who she truly was, and Margot had fallen right into it. Ellison had yet to acknowledge Margot's existence. His focus remained entirely on Celeste, his posture one of deference. "If there is anything that needs to be addressed, Miss Moreau, please let me know," he continued, his words clear, deliberate. Celeste exhaled softly. She lifted her gaze to meet his. And then, for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, she smiled. Not in amusement, not in malice, but in the way someone smiles when they've been waiting for the perfect moment to speak. She uncrossed her legs, her movement smooth, unrushed, completely unbothered. Then she turned and looked directly at Margot. The conductor stiffened, her mouth opening and closing, as if desperate to find the right words to undo the damage already done. But there were no words, no explanations, no excuses, because in that moment, Margot Whitman finally understood. She had made the worst mistake of her life, and now she was about to face the consequences. "Your behavior today has been disgraceful," Celeste said. The entire train car had fallen into absolute silence. Margot's throat tightened, her skin burning as though each word was branding itself onto her. Celeste took a step closer, not aggressive, not threatening, but with absolute certainty. "You've humiliated yourself," she continued, her tone unwavering. "Mistreated a passenger," another step, "and failed your duty." Margot flinched. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to explain, to beg. But Celeste lifted a single hand, and Margot's voice died in her throat. The message was clear. There was nothing she could say that would change what had already been done. Celeste tilted her head slightly, studying her with an unreadable expression. "You didn't know," she said, her voice soft but merciless. "You didn't know, because you didn't bother to treat me with basic respect." Margot's breath hitched. The weight of those words crushed down on her, heavier than anything she had ever felt. Passengers watched, wide-eyed, absorbing every second of the reckoning unfolding before them. The businessman leaned back in his seat, exhaling sharply through his nose, as if he had seen this outcome from the very beginning. The nosy socialite clutched her designer bag like a lifeline, as if the realization had physically shaken her. Even the Carmichaels, who had remained silent through most of the ordeal, now exchanged glances, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Then, the voice that sealed Margot's fate. "Effective immediately," Dominic Ellison said, his tone firm, unshakable. "You are fired." Margot's world collapsed. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath her. The words rang in her skull, repeating, growing louder, suffocating her with their finality. She stumbled forward slightly, reaching for something, anything, to anchor herself. "Wait," she croaked, her voice raw, desperate. Ellison didn't so much as glance at her. Margot turned back to Celeste, her eyes wide with panic. "Miss Moreau, please," she gasped, her breath quickening. I didn't know. I was just following standard protocol. I was only trying to enforce the rules." Celeste's expression didn't change. Calm, unmoved, indifferent. "I own the rules." Margot gasped, Her vision blurred at the edges. Her hands trembled. Passengers stared at her, not with sympathy, not with pity, but with judgment. The same way she had judged Celeste only moments ago. The same way she had judged so many others before her. Suddenly, the uniform she had worn with such pride felt like a noose tightening around her throat. Her stomach twisted violently. No, this couldn't be happening. Not like this. Then a new presence entered the train car. Two uniformed security officers stepped inside, their expressions unreadable, their movements calm but deliberate. Margot's breath caught. They were here for her. Her body went rigid as the reality sank in. Ellison turned to them, his expression cool, professional. "Escort Miss Whitman off the train at the next station," he instructed, his voice devoid of emotion. "Wait!" Margot cried, panic gripping her like ice. She turned wildly, looking for support, for help, for anyone. But the passengers only stared. No one spoke. No one moved. No one came to her defense. The very same people she had once treated with indifference now treated her the same way. The nosy socialite quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in the window outside. The businessman simply shook his head, lips pressed into a thin line. Mrs. Carmichael resumed knitting. Even Isla, the young train attendant who had stood frozen for so long, merely lowered her gaze, refusing to meet Margot's eyes. Margot turned back to Celeste, her last chance, her last hope. She pleaded, "Please." Celeste blinked, her gaze unwavering. For a fraction of a second, there was something unreadable in her eyes. But then she turned away, just like that, dismissed. Margot's breath shuddered from her chest. One of the officers placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Let's go." Margot flinched. She wanted to resist. She wanted to fight. But there was nothing left to fight for. She had lost. And so, with the weight of her own actions crushing her, Margot Whitman, the woman who had prided herself on power, on control, on authority, was led off the train. Passengers watched her go. None of them spoke. None of them stopped it, because justice had already been served. The air inside the train car remained heavy, thick with the remnants of what had just unfolded. The space Margot had occupied only moments ago now felt like a void, a silent reminder of the downfall that had played out before an audience of wide-eyed passengers. The rhythmic hum of the train's motion filled the stillness. Outside, the landscape blurred past, indifferent to the reckoning that had just taken place within these walls. Then Celeste turned. She faced the passengers, her expression calm, composed, just as it had been from the very beginning. "I apologize that you all had to witness this," she said, her voice even, carrying easily through the cabin. "Moving forward, we will ensure that no passenger is ever treated unfairly on my railway." A single beat of silence followed. Then, applause. It started in the back, a slow, deliberate clap, uncertain at first, but then, like a ripple across still water, it spread. More hands joined in. A businessman nodded in approval as he clapped. The nosy socialite, still recovering from her earlier embarrassment, hesitated. Then, deciding to align herself with the winning side, she clapped as well, her rings catching the dim cabin light. Even the Carmichaels, usually reserved, gave small approving nods as they joined the chorus of applause. The sound filled the space, replacing the tension that had lingered only moments before. Celeste accepted it with quiet grace. She didn't need their validation, but she understood what it meant. She had not only claimed victory, she had set a precedent. As the applause settled, Celeste's gaze shifted to Isla. The junior train attendant stood stiffly near the front of the car, her hands clasped together, uncertainty written all over her face. She had hesitated earlier. She had been torn between doing what was right and following orders. But Celeste had noticed something else too. She had seen the moment Ela wanted to speak up, the moment doubt flickered in her eyes, the moment hesitation had not been fear, but a battle with her conscience. Celeste took a step toward her. "You saw what was happening," she said gently. "You knew it wasn't right." Isla swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Yes, ma'am," she said, barely above a whisper. I wanted to say something. I should have." Celeste studied her for a moment, then offered the faintest hint of a smile. "And yet you still tried," she said, "which is why, starting today, you'll be receiving a promotion." Gasps rippled through the nearby passengers. Isla's eyes widened. "A promotion?" she echoed, stunned. Celeste nodded. "The railway needs employees who understand the value of fairness," she said, "who recognize injustice and who have the courage to stand against it. Tears glimmered in Isla's eyes. She had spent so long working under Margot's rule, afraid to overstep, afraid to challenge authority. And now, she nodded quickly, fighting to keep her emotions in check. "Thank you, Miss Moreau," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Celeste gave a single nod of acknowledgement before turning back to her seat. The passengers, still processing everything, exchanged glances. The businessman leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, exhaling as if in deep thought. The pearl-clad woman adjusted her necklace, her earlier judgment now replaced with deep reflection. And then, somewhere in the cabin, a voice, barely a whisper. "She's amazing." Celeste didn't react at first. Then, as she settled into her seat, she turned her gaze toward the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the passing landscape. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, calm, steady, unchanged. She smiled, just slightly. Then, with the softest exhale, she said, "Respect is a right, not a privilege." And as the train surged forward, cutting across the horizon, a lesson had been learned. Not just by Margot, not just by the passengers, but by everyone who had watched it unfold. Because true power isn't in titles or wealth or authority. It's in how you treat others, how you carry yourself, and how you stand your ground, even when the world tells you to move. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, share to others, and subscribe for more powerful stories.